Hey there, Heather Lou of Closet Core Patterns with the last lesson in our Sewalong video series. So in this lesson, I'm going to show you how to put the dress or jumpsuit together with our waistband, and then how to finish it off with the zipper in the back, along with a few other little finishing details that are going to make this a garment that I know that you are going to be very excited to make. So let's jump into it and get that waistband constructed. Let's start to assemble the waistband, and regardless of whether or not you're making the jumpsuit or the dress, this is going to be the same process. So you have 2 front waistband pieces and 4 back waistband pieces, and for the front waistband, one of those needs to be interfaced. So make sure one of your pieces are interfaced. So I've used a little bit of fusible here, and you're going to pin one of the short back waistband pieces to one side seam, and then one of the short back waistbands to the other, and only the front waistband needs to be interfaced. So this back waistband piece on the either end does not need to be interfaced. And then we're going to do it again, and this is going to become the facing. So this is basically the inside of the waistband, and because it's a facing, because we've already interfaced the outside, you don't need to interface the inside. So I'm just going to pin that here and here. And now I'm going to go to my machine and I'm going to sew this seam, this seam, this seam, and this one at 5/8, and we're going to press them open. Now, before we start stitching all of this together, I just want to go and sew a line of stay stitching 1/2 inch along the facing. This is like the inner waistband. And then we're going to use that as a guide to fold up a seam allowance. So let's go do that now. So remember, this is the inside waistband, so it's the one that's not interfaced. And then using that stitch line as a guide, I'm just going to press up the seam allowance 1/2 inch. Now, of course, you don't have to do that. You could just use your seam gauge. But for waistbands and things where it's like you really want to make sure you're accurate, just sewing that little line of stay stitching as a guide really does help. So I'm just pressing this up. Okay, so we can just set this piece aside for now. Now we want to go get our bodice. And it's actually time to attach the waistband to the bodice. So we're going to do the interfaced one first. So let's just turn the bodice around, and we'll just start by lining up the side seams. Okay. Yep, that notch is for center front. And then just pin. And try to pin, all the way along. You want to make sure that the waistband seam is evenly matching. And it helps to pin on top of the darts. So you can pin the darts in place, and that means as you're sewing over them, you won't accidentally force them to go in the other direction. That happens all the time to me. There's another dart here. And then all the way to the end, all the way to center back. Okay, so our waistband is now fully pinned to the bodice. We are going to go sew at 5/8 all the way across. Actually, we're not going to do quite 5/8. We're going to do just under 5/8 because we have to sew the facing to this as well, and we don't want to see this first pass of stitching. So I don't want to do it at 1/2 inch, but I'm going to maybe do just under 5/8. Okay, so we've got the waistband stitch in place, but now we have to put the facing in. So we're basically going to make a little sandwich, and the bodice is going to be the meat, and the waistbands are the buns. So we're now, just to show you how this is the dress bodice, this is the outer waistband, this is the inner waistband. And when everything gets turned to the inside, you're going to be able to see the right side on the inside of your garment, the right side of the waistband facing on the inside of your garment. I'm going to go do the same thing, matching my center front. Matching my side seams. And actually, I'm going to put my pins on the other side because I want to sew this face down on the machine. So I'm going to switch the orientation of my pins. I'll explain why in a moment. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the machine, sew this again in with a 5/8 stitch. Okay, so because the facing is not interfaced, sometimes when you're sewing a more stable surface or layer to a less stable one, i.e. a non-interfaced one, the non-interfaced one will kind of want to stretch out. And so one way to prevent that is to put that stretchier layer, the one more prone to stretching, against your feed dogs. And the feed dogs will basically help ease everything in. So you don't end up having, you know, sometimes you'll have like a pucker where the non-interface side wants to kind of like stretch out and go like that. So by putting that side on the needle plate, you won't have to worry about that. So that's what we're going to do now. And now we're sewing this exactly at 5/8. And I'm back stitching at the end. Okay, so we've now sandwiched the bodice in between the inner facing and the outer facing. And before we go and press anything, I want to grade seams. So just as a little reminder about grading seams, what we want to avoid is when all of this is pressed down, we want to avoid this really chonky seam here. It's a lot of bulk. You're going to see, I can see it just through the fabric right now because it's so thick. So we want to grade those seams. And you always want to leave the longest seam, the outside seam, like the one that's touching the outside of the fabric, is the longest. And the shortest one is the closest one to you. So I'm going to go through with my applique scissors and I'm going to grade this seam. So the shortest one is basically the facing, and I'm going to trim that down to about 1/4 of an inch. I'll do this with it down. It's a little bit easier. And again, because I'm using the applique scissors, I'm not too worried about accidentally trimming another seam. Another way you can reduce bulk when grading is when you're crossing a seam like this, if you just go in and on a diagonal trim, that also helps to reduce bulk. So this first seam is graded, and now I'm going to go and grade the bodice seam. So that's the middle seam. And I'm just going to grade this a little bit. So I don't know, maybe 1/8 of an inch, like that. So what ends up happening is you don't end up having one big chunky seam. They're graded. They're almost like steps. And you should be doing this almost any time you have a thick seam, especially in things like waistbands, pockets. Grade your seams. Okay, so this seam is now fully graded, and now we can press everything down. So once and again, I'm going to get my tailor's ham out, and I'm going to start with the outer waistband. So from the inside, just going to press this down. Actually, let me do it on this side. So I'll keep that seam down, and then I'll press this. So once that outer one is pressed down, you can turn this around, and now we'll press the facing down. Press that down. Okay, so we've got everything pressed down, and guess what? Very exciting. We're now going to attach the bottom half. So I've made a skirt and I've made a pair of pants. I think for this version, I'm going to actually attach the pants to this waistband. It's the same procedure. So what we're going to do is find center front of the pants, find the center front notch on the waistband, and we're going to pin it. And we'll do the same thing with if it was the skirt. So it's the same procedure. And now I would do your side seams. And one thing I want you to be conscious of when you're pinning is that you're not just matching your side seams, but you're also matching darts, because the dart, let's see if I can turn this over and show you. This dart should feel like a continuous line down. So just be conscious of that when you're pinning, that you want to make sure that not only are you matching here and here, but that that dart looks aligned. Even though you're going to have that waistband in between, if it's really off, you're going to see it. So I'm kind of just lining, I'm like opening this up. I'm kind of like lining up my darts there. Pinning. Great. I know that's kind of lined up. And then I'm doing the same thing on this side. So I'm just kind of lining up my dart. It's not perfect. It's not the end of the world, but might as well make an effort. And now we do our side seam, and then you're just going to pin this all the way towards center back. And you might remember that with the pants, we press that seam allowance closed, so you're just going to press it open and pin. And now we're going to go to the machine and we're going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch all the way around. Okay, I'm at my sewing machine. I just realized I should have put the pins on the waistband side, because I actually want to sew with the waistband facing up, and that is because you really want to make sure that you're maintaining an even distance here. So if the bottom layer gets a little misaligned, that's, you know, I'm not losing any sleep over it. I really want to try to keep this distance between this needle and this stitch line as even as possible. So if I can see it while I'm sewing it, should make it a bit easier. And now we're going to go back to the pressing station. Okay, so we need to press all of this open, or sorry, we need to press everything up. But now we have that same issue, right? Where the braided seams, like now we're adding this, and holy mama, like this is like a pretty stuffed submarine sandwich in here. Like we need to get rid of some toppings. If we're sandwich artists, we are removing some lettuce. So I'm gonna grade these seams as well. Where are my grading scissors? But don't forget this little dude. This dude is actually the one that needs to get graded, and by this dude I need the seam allowance of the facing, is the one that needs to get graded the most, because it's the one that's sitting closest to the body. So I'm going to start with that one, and I'm going to grade it down. I don't want to grade it too much. I'm just going to trim a little bit off, because we have to make sure we're catching that, and we don't have any gaps. So I'm just taking, like, I don't know, a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch off. Grading is one of those steps that you're like, I'm in a rush, I'm not going to do it, but just do it. Makes such a nice difference, and just makes such a big difference in your clothes. Again, here's that little bit. I'm going to come in here and doop, doop. So now we're going to do one more graded seam. Oh no, we've got, no, yeah, 2. So now this one, the pants seam or the skirt seam, I'm going to grade. I don't want to do it too aggressively. Like I don't want to go down to 1/4 of an inch, because I've done that before. I've graded those really aggressively, and then you wash something a couple times and then all of a sudden you have holes in your clothes. So I'm just taking about 1/4 of an inch off. But there's like quite a few layers here with the pockets and stuff. So it's a great thing to grade these. Okay, everything is graded. Woo! Okay. Give this a little shake. So now, if you want, you can come, actually no, not if you want, you have to. So take your tailor's ham again, and then come and press this seam up. Press that waist seam up now that it's been graded. Okay, so now that everything's graded and we're ready to go, we are going to stitch in the ditch the back waistband. So from the side seam to center back, we're going to stitch in the ditch, which just means that you're going to stitch right on top of that seam line, like basically right next to it, as close as you can, to try to hide that stitch. And the reason that we had pressed the seam allowance on the facing under by a 1/2 inch is because now it should extend, if I go look on the other side, it should extend past that stitch line by about 1/8. So if I come and I stitch in the ditch all the way along, I should be able to catch that facing with my stitches. So how do I guarantee that I'm going to do that? Well, I'm going to come from this side and I'm going to pin. I'm going to catch that little tiny bit that's extending right next to that seam line. I'm going to make sure that I'm grabbing it with my pin, and that way I know I'm going to grab it with my needle when I come and I stitch it in place at the machine. And I'm just using my fingers here. And we're going to stop at the side seam. And now we want to do the exact same thing on the other side. Okay, so it is time now to stitch in the ditch the back waistband section. And I've already just gone and done one side so that I could show you. So you can see I'm like basically trying to hide that stitch line in between that seam line. It's not perfectly invisible, but nobody is going to notice, right? Like if I'm holding it even a couple inches away from the camera, you don't see it anymore. So once again, the best foot for this is the edge stitch foot. And that's because the edge stitch guide is going to line up right with the seam line that you're trying to sew next to. And this edge stitch foot is slightly different than the other one I was using. So you can see this one here, there's like a wider opening through here. This one is it's a 1/4 inch foot, and there's, I don't know if you can see, but there's a little tiny hole so you can't move the needle position. The needle has to stay centered, and it's going to sew directly centered along the guideline. It's going to do the same thing here. I just bought this new foot, so I'm trying it out. But again, edge stitch foot, your best friend here. If you don't have an edge stitch foot, you can do this with a regular foot, absolutely, but you just have to be very careful and sew very slowly because you don't have the benefit of this guide. So I'm just back stitching at the end, and then again, I'm letting my guideline do all the work. I'm looking at the guideline and I'm trying to keep the edge of the fabric aligned with the guideline. And I have pinned in the underside of the facing, so as I'm sewing, I'm just using my nail to make sure I can feel it so I know that I'm going to catch it with my stitching. And now, as I approach the side seam, I'm just going to back stitch right here. I don't want to really sew much further past the side seam. We're going to sew this part separately in the next step. So just stop at the side seam and back stitch. And let's see. So it looks pretty good. It's right in between that seam line. Right there. And then I did see, it looks like I caught it all the way. I didn't miss any spots. So this is great. I did it good. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how to thread our elastic through this new channel. Okay, so before we can install the elastic, we need to cut it. So in the instructions, go check your size. We provide an elastic length for your size. It's just a guideline, but it helps you pre-cut a good size instead of having to guesstimate. So I'm a size 14, and so I'm going to cut 2 9-inch long pieces of elastic because that's the length I was told to cut. It's on the same page as the fabric requirements. So now that I've done that, you're also going to need a safety pin for this step. So I'm just going to attach one of the elastics with a safety pin. Okay, so here's my elastic. I have gone and just attached a safety pin to one side, and I've just put a mark on either end, just so I can know, make sure that this isn't twisting in the channel. And the elastic, like the waistband is quite tight, like it's literally just gonna fit within here. So as you're pulling it through, you might notice that the elastic wants to twist, and so I'm gonna try to prevent that from happening, at least so I know, like, okay, this is the side. If I pull this side through, On this side I want to see a mark, and then on this side I want to see a mark. So I'm going to just start pulling this through, and I'm coming in from that opening in the waistband because we stopped stitching in the ditch at the side seam. And I'm just going to feed this through. And it might want to fold as you're pulling it through, so try to get it in a bit. If you have no roll elastic, that would be the best because you know it's not going to fold. And as I'm pulling it through, I'm just kind of trying to keep the elastic flat with my thumb. And I can see it's going in pretty flat. And you want to be careful as you get to the end because we need a little bit of elastic on this side. So as you're pulling it through, try not to let it go all the way through the channel. Oh, did I pull it? I pulled it too much. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, that I'm going to fix that in a minute, what I'm going to do is pull that safety pin out. I'm going to flatten the elastic in the channel. Make sure it's lying nice and flat. It's not folded. And I want the mark that I made. I'm just going to put a little pin here to keep this nice and anchored. I'm just doing this so I don't pull it through anymore. And I'm going to use my tweezers to pull it through. And the mark should be facing down. So I'm just going to kind of pull on the elastic so it's not folding. Just check, it's not folding, it's lying nice and flat inside. So now I'm just going to get it kind of lined. Oop, I lost it again. See, it's a little finicky. It's a slippery little sucker. Okay, gonna pin that elastic in place. So now that elastic is lined up here. And remember when I was pulling it through, I kind of lost it around here. So I'm just gonna pull this through. I'm gonna go in with my tweezers and grab the edge of it. And this is just a little bit tricky because the channel is quite tight. Okay, there, I've got the elastic pulled through. I want it just extending like a little bit, like 1/4 of an inch, just enough that I can catch it when I stitch in the ditch. And then from the right side, I'm going to pin it. And now I'm going to go and stitch in the ditch right along here to anchor that elastic. Okay, so we're about to sew the elastic in place. We're going to stitch in the ditch along the side seam from the outside of the garment. And the elastic you can't see, but is extending past this side seam by about 1/4 of an inch, just enough for me to catch it. I switched back to a regular foot here because my edge stitch foot was like not loving all of these layers. And part of that is because there's a million layers here. So if your machine is really struggling to sew through everything, you might want to use your hand wheel to kind of help you get through these seams. But it seems like it's working now. And I'm just sewing really slowly right down the center of that seam to try to hide this stitching. And then as I get to the end, I'm going to backstitch as well. Okay, so it looks pretty good. It's nearly invisible. Nobody's going to notice that. And then before we finish, we need to secure the other side. So we've pulled the elastic through all the way here. Once again, you might want to just pull this tight and make sure that the elastic's nice and flat and that it's not twisting inside. And then on this side, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to just come, I would say, at about 1/4 of an inch. You just want to lock that elastic in place. And now you should be able to kind of pull this and make sure that the gathers are evenly distributed along the elastic all the way through. Make sure it's lying nice and flat, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, so we've gone and stitched that elastic into place, and at this point you can try your jumpsuit on. You might want to, I would actually definitely recommend trying it on. Just baste the waist closed at that 5/8 seam allowance to make sure that you're happy with the amount of gathering. Maybe you need a little bit more room. Maybe the elastic's not tight enough. You need to add a little bit of gathering. So now is the time to figure that out. And the next step is we're going to top stitch the waistband, the front waistband. So we kind of want to mimic the look of the bias tape. So we're going to sew a row of top stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from this seam and this seam, and that will catch the facing with the top stitching. And I'm going to just do what I did before and just make sure from the right side that that facing is in place. But unlike the back waistband where we stitched in the ditch, we're going to be actually stitching on top of the waistband. So we're much more likely to catch it. So just pin that facing all the way around just to make sure it's secure. And then once we're done those 2 rows of top stitching, we're going to sew a line of top stitching down the center of the entire waistband from front to back. So all the way across the elastic, all the way across the center and the front, and then all the way across the back. And the idea is that we're kind of mimicking the look of this bias tape finish. So let's go to the machine and do those 2 rows of top stitching here. So I've got my edge stitch foot back on. And again, I'm going to move my needle over to same position I did for my bias tape. I'm going to line up my guide right on the side seam. I'm going to just do a little back stitch. And then slowly and steadily, I'm going to top stitch along the top of that waistband, letting the guide do all my work resting on this seam. And then back stitching at the end. And now we want to do the same on the other side. So now I'm going to move my needle position to position of 2 on the other side. Again, lining up my guide against that seam. And once again, because the waistband facing, it's, ends about here underneath, I'm not really all that concerned about catching it. I know I'm going to catch it. Just make sure you pull out your pins before you get there. And then back stitch at the end. Okay, so once you've top stitched that waistband, just turn it over and make sure that you caught the facing with your stitching. And once that you're sure that you have, make sure your elastic is really evenly distributed in that channel. And now we're going to sew straight down the middle of this waistband all the way across. And I've just switched back to my regular foot, just because I find it's easier to see what I'm doing with this little clear foot. And like I said, we're going to sew straight down the middle. You can mark the middle line. I'm going to just eyeball it and make sure that I keep my foot evenly centered on the waistband. And as I'm sewing the elastic, the trick is that you kind of want to pull it as you're sewing. So you want to pull it and have the elastic lying flat as you're sewing. So it's, you're trying to do a few things at once. So you want to just sew nice and slow. Don't rush. If it helps you, you could maybe pull it tight, pin it a few times just to keep the gathers evenly distributed, and then just gather a little bit as you go, but I'm going to just try to do it all in one go. So I'm pulling the elastic and I'm sewing at the same time while I'm trying to center my needle. And I'm just going to start like this until I can get something I can hold on to on the back. Okay, and once this is pulled through, now I have something that can help me stabilize. So I'm going to use my right hand to hold the center front, and then I'm using my left hand to stretch. And then just trying to keep my needle centered on the waistband channel. And you don't want to pull too hard, like you don't want to pull the elastic through, you just want to kind of guide it and straighten it out so that you're not sewing over puckers. And now as you approach the front waistband, there's no need to pull anything. Everything's lying nice and flat, so you just want to make sure to keep your needle centered while you sew down the middle of the waistband. Okay, so now we're coming back around to the gathered elastic waistband. So once again, I'm just kind of I'm not pulling with my hand back here, but I'm just helping guide it as I keep the waistband straight with my other hand. And what I don't want is to have a little bump here, because we did a little bit of stitching to stitch that elastic in to stitch the elastic along the center seam. It's kind of hard to get in there and pull this straight, so I'm just going to use my tweezers as I'm sewing this last little bit so I don't have like a weird bump. There we go. And then I'm going to back stitch at the end, and then we're done. Okay, so our waistband's done. Just to show you what this is going to look like now, you've got your 2 rows of top stitching, you've got your row down the center, and then I have the top stitching going all the way down my elastic waist. So the jumpsuit is more or less ready to go now. The last thing that we need to do is to put in the zipper. So let's have a little conversation about that. So before we sew in the zipper, we need to finish the center back seam. And if you made the jumpsuit, the pants seam we already finished. We finished that when we constructed the pants, but we still need to finish the bodice center back seam here, and also this waistband, because when this gets all pressed to the inside, this will be visible on the inside of your garments. You want this to be finished nicely. Once again, you can use a serge stitch like I'm going to do. You could finish it with a zigzag, or you could wrap it and finish it with bias binding. And so that's it for the jumpsuit. But if you made the dress, we never finished. Imagine that the skirt, excuse me, is attached to the dress. We never finished this seam. So what you would do with the dress is finish the entire center back seam from the neckline through the waistband all the way down to the hem on either side. With the jumpsuit, once again, you only need to finish from the top of the neckline to the waistband. The other thing I want you to do right now is to just remove a little bit of those basting stitches from the bias tape, because you don't want to include the bias tape in your finishing or in the zipper construction. So if you had any little, now is the time to undo those basting stitches, which of course are going to give me more trouble because I'm not using a seam ripper. There we go. So you just want to liberate the neckline from that bias tape on either side. And I'm going to go to my serger right now, and I'm going to finish this seam, and then we'll come back and have one more little quick chat about what the next step is. Okay, so I have gone and I've completed finishing the seam of center back. Because I already finished the pants, I only needed to kind of overlap it a little bit. It does it, there is serging overlapping. If you're doing the dress, you just did the entire thing in one pass. So you did the left side and the right side in one pass, in one continuous pass of zigzagging or serging or whatever. Now the jumpsuit is already attached, like I said. It starts at that notch. So what I want to do now is I want to continue matching the center back seam. So I'm going to be really careful matching my waistband seams, because it's matching when you're wearing the garment. So you want these to line. This is a really thick area, so I'm just going to use some clips here to help me anchor this rather than try to get a pin through this. Like even the clips having a hard time. And then I'm just going to pin the center backs together all the way to the neckline. And just a reminder that the center back seam should have a little bit of interfacing as a stabilizer. So the center back seam is now pinned together. If this was the dress, I would continue pinning all the way down the length of the skirt. So we're basically going to baste the area where the zipper is going to be installed, okay? And we're basting because the zipper is, we need to open up this seam eventually so that we can do the zipper up, you know, take it up and down. So we don't want to do a regular stitch length here. We want to put in a basting stitch. It's just a temporary tack until the zipper is installed. So what we're going to do at the machine is from the neckline to the notch, we're going to baste. And if you're doing the jumpsuit, you can basically stop your sewing there because you already sewed the pants up until that notch. So you're just going to baste to meet basically the line where it stopped at that notch. If you're making the skirt, however, you still need to finish sewing the rest of the center back seam. So at that notch, you're going to switch to a short stitch length. You're going to back stitch just right here, and then you're going to stitch all the way to the end. So in both cases, jumpsuit and dress, from neckline until notch, it's basted, and from there on down, it's basically just a regular stitch length. So we're going to go to the machine, and we're going to baste at 5/8, being really careful around the waistband area. Okay, so before we go and sew this entire center back seam, one thing that I like to do when I'm trying to match something like a waistband seam across a zipper is before I go and sew the entire thing, I like to just try to baste this in place and get it lined up before I go and sew the rest of it. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm just trying to baste and anchor this together. So that when I go and sew the final seam, I know that it's lined up. So I'm just going to check this from the other side and see if I got it matching. And I do. So now I'm going to feel confident as I come to sew the seam that it's already tacked together and where it needs to be. So once again, you want to leave a basting stitch in your machine, and we're going to sew to the notch with a long basting stitch at 5/8. Okay, and as I approach the notch right here, I'm going to backstitch. And if I was sewing the skirt, I'd switch to a regular stitch length and sew all the way down at 5/8. But in this case, it's the jumpsuit, so I don't need to. Okay, so this is starting to feel like it's making sense. What we want to do now is press the seam open. So I'm going to get under here with my ham, and I'm going to press the seam open. And if you were sewing the dress, you would press it open all the way to the hem. But because I'm making the jumpsuit, I had already pressed one part of the seam in one direction and I'd clipped it. So now it's lying perfectly flat and everything's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So now we need to decide if we need to shorten our zipper. So I want you to lie your garment flat like this with the seam, pressed up seam facing you. And we're going to decide how long our zipper needs to be and whether or not it needs to be shortened. And I want you to start, so these little zipper stops right here, I want you to start this a 1/2 inch below your neckline. And the reason that is because at the end, we are going to wrap the bias tape around the top of the neckline and we're going to put in a hook and eye. And so if you have your zipper going all the way to the top, you're not going to get a nice finish with the bias tape. So 1/2 inch below, if you need me to, I'm going to draw that in for you. So right here is where we want those the zipper stop. That's where we want it to go. And then I just want you to line your zipper up with your center back and then mark on the zipper where the zipper should end, which should just basically be right below that notch. Like you could have it extend just slightly so that when the zipper is installed, you don't see this little raw bit here. So let's say like, I don't know, 1/4 of an inch longer than that notch. So I'm going to mark that with my marking tool, and I'm just going to double check again that that's the right length. And this is where I'm going to cut my zipper. If it's only like an inch or something and you're doing the dress and you have a closed end zipper, you could probably just sew it all the way to the end and not trim it. But if you have a really long zipper, you do want to trim it. With the dress, basically, it's a little less important because the entire seam is pressed open. And once you know where that mark is, and maybe you don't need to shorten your zipper, maybe you do, I want you to take a pair of old craft scissors, so not your fabric scissors, and I want you to actually cut your zipper. And now I'm going to show you at the machine how we can sew a little bar tack here to basically make a new zipper stop. So in order to shorten our zipper, we need to add a new zipper stop. And so we're going to use a bar tack as a zipper stop. And I want it to be right about here, about a 1/2 inch, 5/8 of an inch away from where I trimmed it. So I'm going to center the zipper teeth on my foot. And I'm going to make a really wide bar tack. So right now I've got it set at 5. I've made it as short as I can, which is about 1. And what you want to make sure is that the bar tack is wide enough that it won't get caught on the teeth. So I'm just using my hand wheel right now. And it's just completed the zigzag, and it's not getting caught on the zipper teeth. So I'm going to just go ahead and sew 6 or 7 times to make a bar tack here. And then I'm going to trim it. And now I have this bar tack. So if I go and try to undo this zipper, it's going to get stuck on that thread and not go any further. The other thing that we want to do is we are at some point going to go and top stitch all the way around the zipper, and I don't want to top stitch over these teeth here. So as close as I can, I'm just going to trim those teeth. And again, better to do this with an old pair of scissors, not your good fabric scissors. And I'm going to clip those teeth. So now I just have the zipper tape, and all of this will end up getting secured in a moment. I just showed you how to shorten your zipper and how to add the bar tack, but sometimes when you trim zipper tape, it can unravel. So I just want to show you a little tip to get that to not happen. After I cut it, I just took a match and very gently singed the sides, all of the raw edges where I had trimmed the zipper teeth out. And so because the zipper is plastic, it melted, and it's kind of almost, it's not going to unravel now, right? It's all kind of melted together. Obviously, you want to be really gentle and delicate because otherwise you don't want to burn the entire zipper. And I am seeing a little bit of the burn mark on the back side, so that's one side effect of that. You might see a little bit of a singe, but to me it's worth it because I know that this isn't going to unravel. Now we're going to turn our garment inside out. And we're going to get our zipper in place. Now, this might seem like more work than sewing an invisible zipper, and it is. It's also more obvious. You are going to see the stitch lines where the zipper is installed when you're wearing the garment. And I can't remember if I mentioned this or not before, but the reason for that is when you install an invisible zipper on a seam line like this one, where we have multiple layers, we have waistbands, we have elastic, I don't know about you, but my invisible zippers get stuck all the time. And so then you have to pee really bad and you're trying to get your clothes off and you can't because the zipper pull is getting stuck and sometimes the zipper breaks. So we really wanted to create an easy to get on zipper. And so for us, the solution was a traditional zipper, but there are a few more steps in order to make it look beautiful. So we're taking those steps now. If you have had experience doing hand pick zippers, you're welcome to do a hand pick zipper here, but we're going to machine stitch this in place. So like I mentioned before, you want your zipper stop at the top of your zipper to line up with that 1/2 inch mark that we made. Just going to make sure that it's lining up. And of course, you can pin this zipper into place, but because we're sewing this zipper from the opposite side, you know, if you do pins, they're going to get stuck in your needle plate as you're sewing. What I'm actually going to do, in the instructions, we give you the option that you can either tape this zipper in place. So if you have Scotch tape, you could go ahead and put a few pieces of Scotch tape here, and then right side up when we go to sew the zipper in place, you're just going to sew right over the Scotch tape. So that's like kind of the quick option. I actually prefer to hand baste my zippers in place. It just gives you the most control. The zipper is exactly where you want it to be. And so I'm just pinning this zipper in place right now because I'm going to hand baste it. And I'm going to show you how to do that. And hand sewing is one of those things that I find a lot of people avoid doing. And I've learned the hard way that truly like a stitch in time saves nine. Taking that couple of minutes to hand, like especially like something like this where you need to anchor it in place, you need a temporary tack. It just works. Hand basting gives you so much more control than pins. And I can't tell you how many times I've skipped hand stitching something and then I have to rip it out multiple times because I'm trying to sew it in place by machine. So just take my advice, like get into the habit when you're doing something like this. Hand basting can really save you a lot of time in the long run. So what I'm trying to do is just center the zipper teeth on the center front seam and then pinning it in place through front and back. And I'm going to do that all the way to the bottom. And I'm just going to put one pin down here. And now I'm going to hand baste this in place. So I've just gone in thread and needle. I probably did this a bit longer than I needed to. And I'm just threading a single thread with a knot at the end. And I'm just going to really quickly, starting from the top, do a long running stitch, ensuring that my zipper is centered. And I'm talking really long, like you could do like a 1/2 inch. So just think of this like you're replacing pins. It doesn't need to be neat. It can be really quick and dirty. And you're just tacking this zipper in place. And it will end up making sewing this zipper easier. Just taking this couple of minutes to do this. Okay, so here's the zipper. You can see how big my stitches are really quickly. That took me, I don't know, not even 5 minutes. This is what it looks like from the other side. And so it's just really already, it's where I need it to be. I don't need to worry about messing with pins. I'm going to go sew this at the machine now using my zipper foot. And it's made my life so much easier because I'm not dealing with a bunch of tape or pins or anything. Now that everything's basted in, the last thing that I want to do to just make sewing the zipper in a little bit easier is just to mark some stitch line guides for me. You don't need to do this, but I find I tend to sew a straighter line because you're going to be sewing down this way, so you don't have any reference point to match to. It's not like you can look at your needle plate. So I do find it helpful to just come in and mark where I want to stitch, which is 1/4 of an inch. So I'm just using my seam gauge, and I'm using a little piece of chalk that I'm confident is going to be removed, but only do this with tools that you know are going to come off. So I'm not doing the whole thing. I'm just doing it, every inch or so, just so I know where to stop. And where I want to find is where that bar tack or where the zipper stop is. Find it with my finger. It's like right there. I want to make sure that when I come around, I'm sewing beneath the zipper tape. So I'm going to mark a horizontal line there. So when I come down, I'm going to come down, turn around here, and then go back up again. So then I want to mark the 1/4 inch on the other side. So now I've got 2 parallel lines of 1/4 inch away from center front. I've marked where the bottom of that zipper is. I'm just going to be doubly sure because what I want to catch is the tape, but I don't want to hit the zipper teeth. So I'm just going to make doubly sure. Yeah, I'm feeling good about that. And now we're going to go to our machine, put on our zipper foot, and then sew this in place. Okay, so here I am at my machine. And I want to show you another reason why we take the time to baste and draw the lines and do all that stuff. It can be really tricky with a zipper foot to sew around the stop. I find that once if I'm trying to stitch around the stop, my line goes like this, do 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 do. So I find it really helpful if you've basted and you've drawn that line in, you can actually rip out the beginning of this basting stitch. So you can access the pull. Okay, I'm going to go down a little bit further. You can pull that pull literally right out of the way. If you need to, you can kind of pin the zipper tape in place up here. Let's do it vertically so it's not going anywhere. And now I'm going to start, first of all, I'm going to move my needle over. I'm not going to tell you how to use your zipper foot. It's going to be a little bit different for everybody. But I'm lining up my needle with the edge of my zipper foot. And then that is going to be the guide line. That's going to be the line that I'm stitching along. I'll pull that pin out now. And I'm very grateful I've marked that line. And here, I'm going to start sewing that zipper tape in place. I'm just going to back stitch a bit at the beginning. And I'm going to follow my guide line. And then as I approach this zipper stop, rather than trying to sew around it, I'm going to pull it up and continue sewing along that guide line. And what I want to do is just keep my fabric nice and flat. And I just want to try to follow my guideline and keep this nice and straight and keep my needle an equal distance away from the center front seam. And as I'm sewing right now, the basting stitches is kind of rippling the fabric, so I'm just going to rip that out so I can keep this nice and flat. And look, I am about to approach a big area. So I want to use my hump jumper here to rest my foot on. And you can use a package of needles, you could use a piece of cardboard. You just want something that's going to help get that presser foot level with this area so that it doesn't get stuck. And I'm sewing really slowly. And look at that, I'm not going to get stuck, and then I'm just going to start sewing directly through the elastic. And here you want to go slow, you're sewing through a lot of layers. You might need to use your hand wheel, and I would encourage you also to just make sure that your dress is out of the way, that your bodice is out of the way, that all that you're sewing right now is this zipper. Okay, and then as we get to that horizontal line that we marked, we're going to leave our needle down. We're going to turn our work. You're going to put your foot down again. We're going to go across. You're going to leave your needle down, raise your presser foot, turn your work. Press your foot down. Again, just make sure nothing's caught and you're just sewing on the zipper. And then you're going to continue sewing up the back. And as we come back to this, where the zipper pull is, I'm just going to pull it down past where I'm sewing, and then continue sewing and back stitching. Okay, so let's take a look and see how I did. This is pretty good. I've managed to get these lines really even. I didn't get any weird stitching around the thickness of this. I turned the corner nicely. I think that looked pretty good. I would say that unless it's super, super obvious, if there's a little few spots where it's wonky, again, nobody really cares. Nobody notices. Don't go and rip all of this out. If there's just a few little bad zones, you can either just deal with that particular area or honestly leave it. Perfection is exhausting. So what I'm going to do now is remove all of those hand basting stitches, and then I'm going to remove the basting stitch that holds center front together, and then we're going to be able to have a functional zipper. Okay, so I'm just going to open up that center back basting. So the proper way to use a seam ripper is you always put the ball down and then you push it along the seam and it protects underneath. But I'm just going to do this very gently so I'm not ripping the fabric. Okay, so I've removed all the basting stitches. The final step should be pressing this zipper, but because I use that blue chalk, I don't want to use any steam or heat on the zipper right now because I need to wash this, to wash the chalk out, because if that chalk lasts forever, I'm going to be really sad. So I'm going to wash this and then I'll probably give this a press. One thing to note with this zipper treatment is that because of the elastic waist, there's tension on the seam. So if it bugs you while you're wearing it, that you can see the zipper teeth here, like while you're wearing it, if that bothers you, you're welcome to sew a hook and eye here as well. So if you put a hook and an eye here, you would be able to hide that. So that's another option. Me, doesn't bother me so much. Okay, we are so close to being done. We're so close. I can taste it and it tastes delicious. So what we are going to do now is finish this neckline. And you'll remember that we basted all of this in place because we didn't want to finish it, you know, to the nth degree. So I just want to make sure that everything's doing up nicely. Tis. So what I want to do now is just trim this neckline. You can see when I installed the zipper, it's now, this neckline's like a little bit shorter. So I'm just going to trim everything here. So we're all at the same level. Need to take about 1/8 of an inch off here. Like that, so it's nice and level. And what we're going to do is exactly what we did with the skirt. If you made the skirt, you'll remember. We are going to sew this closed and turn it inside out so that it encloses this neckline. We're going to do it on both sides. So what I want to do is open this tape. It might actually help to mark this with a pen. Open this tape. Open this tape. I really just sounded Canadian. And I'm going to mark where I want to sew so that it's a straight line and I can wrap this around it. So I kind of want to do that, and I'm going to do that on the other side. Right there. That's where I want to sew. Straight line. So I'm going to just trim off. We've got a lot hanging loose here that we don't need, so let's just trim that down. Let's trim that down, and we're going to go sew that at the machine. So we're at the machine, and I'm going to try to, I'm just going to double check that this is where I need it to be. Yes. So I'm trying to press this bias tape along the crease because I want it to be perfectly folded. And I'm going to center. Now I'm glad I shouldn't maybe have trimmed the bias tape quite so much. Would have given me a little bit more to hang on to. Okay, so let's go slow here. I'm just sealing this up and then a little quick back stitch. Okay. So we just want to quickly, before we do anything, is just make sure that when this is tucked inside out, we're tucking this inside out, and that we just want to make sure there's enough room. And yeah, it's perfect. So now that I'm sure that's the case, I'm just going to trim this, and I'm going to leave a kind of trim on a diagonal towards the stitching. I'm going to turn this inside out. I'm just going to push that corner out. Now would be a good time to trim any loose threads. Get rid of anything that's diddle-daddling here. If you want, you could maybe even grade the zipper a bit so it's not so thick. And then what you're going to do is you're going to slide this over the neckline like that. And you'll have a little bit here. You could trim that if you want. I guess I should go in and do that. I almost want to trim it at the end though. So I'm going to use one of my clips, and rather than sewing, so we still have to finish sewing this from here to here. I'm going to try to do it at the machine in one pass. So I'm just going to secure. Now, if you wanted to, you could also hand baste all of this in place right now. That would probably be the easiest thing to do, is hand baste this in place so that you can go and do this little bit of top stitching and you're not worried about anything shifting around. But I'm just going to clip it, and I'm going to start sewing, and I'm sewing, you know, basically an eighth of an inch away from the seam line. Sorry, since we're starting right at the end, I always like to have like an awl or a seam rip around, because I'm going to just help guide this piece so it doesn't get jammed in my machine. So I'm just gently guiding it with that awl. I do need to backstitch here, but I'm just going to use that awl to help feed the piece, and I'm going very slowly right now. Okay, now we're out of danger. And I'm just going to meet that original stitching and backstitch. And so now this has been attached. I probably could have started a little bit closer. I'm just going to trim my seams. But the last thing to do now is I'm going to finish the other side, the other end of the neckline. We'll put in our hook and eye, and then we're almost done. Okay, we're getting close, promise. So I want us to sew the zipper pull next. And so just as a reminder, that zipper pull just attaches to the zipper, and it makes it really easy to get it on and off. In the instructions, we have you sew a tube and turn it inside out. But when you're sewing a really narrow tube, and depending on how thick your fabric is, you might find that challenging. So here I'm actually going to have us do something a little bit different than what we call for in the instructions. So what I want you to do is to take that zipper pull piece, and we're going to cut off a 1/2 inch. So I just marked, we want the zipper pull to be 1 inch wide total. And next we are going to fold this in half. So I'm not using the same fabric that I use for my dress because it's quite thick, and I'm using that kind of neutral white. So you could use a contrast color if you wanted to have some fun. So you're going to fold that 1 inch piece in half. And this part's a little tricky with a hot iron, but you want to press the 2 raw edges into the middle. So you basically want the crease that you just pressed, you want to match the raw edges to that. I'm actually just going to use my seam gauge here instead of my fingers. Okay, so once those raw edges are meeting in the middle, we're gonna just fold it in half again. So now we have this piece with the seam allowances folded in and folded in half. And now at the machine, we'll go and edge stitch this and make a really simple tube that doesn't involve you having to actually turn a tube, and it works a little bit better for thicker fabric. So I just need to stitch this closed, and because I don't really have anything to hang on to, I'm going to just start stitching a little bit further in. And I'm just sewing about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. And as it comes through the back, I can now use my finger to hang on to it and help guide. Okay, so this is what that looks like once we've done that. Now, what you could do, so you have to finish the edges. So you could tuck it under and fold it and stitch it. I guess you could slip stitch that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to tie this on a little knot at the end. On one side. Pull it really tight. I just yanked on that with my teeth. And I'm going to trim this little bit. Okay, so once you've got your zipper pull finished, you're going to want to weave it through your hole. And the pull on mine, this hole is quite big. The pull on yours is probably going to be pretty small. So you might have to use some tweezers to get it through. And then you're going to tie a knot, or however you're finishing the edge. Trim it. And now you want to sew it closed. So I'm going to sew a line. I'm going to actually have to remove, this is a weird zipper. I might have to cut this little pull thing off here, but I'm going to sew a line directly across here. I'll show you what it looks like on another version. So this is likely what it will look like on your zipper. So you want to sew that line to anchor it, and now you have this great zipper pull that's going to help you get your dress on and off. Lastly, I'm not going to show you how to do this on camera. The last step is you're going to want to sew a hook and eye on your dress. And so depending if you're left or right-handed, you can decide what side you want to have the hook and what side you want to have the eye on. But I always find it helpful to sew the eye first and then use that to determine the width of the hook. So you'll do that by hand using a matching thread, and then guess what? You are absolutely done. It was a labor of love, but you truly made an absolutely beautiful garment that nobody else on earth has, and I hope you feel super proud of your accomplishment. Guys, we're done. We're done. You did it. I am so proud of you. I'm sure you just made something beautiful. I hope you are so proud of yourself. I hope you learned something new. I, for one, really, really want to see what you made. So if you're on social media, please share your Joe using the hashtag ClosetCoreJoe to make it easy for us to find you. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn more from us, if you'd like to hang out more with me and learn more about what I know about sewing, we've got a number of really great classes over at closetcorepatterns.com where we walk you through how to sew a beautiful tailored blazer, how to make beautiful custom-made jeans. Yes, you can do it, I promise. How to sew a swimsuit, or if you really want to bone up on your real basic skills, I've got a Learn to Sew class that will basically teach you everything that I know about sewing. All of our online sewing classes also include a sewing pattern, which is great. You kind of get the pattern and get to sew it along with me. In the meantime, if you liked this, please like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments if you like the sew along. We'll make more. And in the meantime, we've got lots more content coming to you on YouTube this year. I, for one, had a great time. I hope you did too, and I hope you have a wonderful night out in your Joe the first time you wear it. See you later.